Hi, Tim.
Hi, Will. How are you doing?
Very well. How are you?
I'm great. I'm not even slightly jet-lagged, and it's nice to see you again. It's been a while.
It has been a while. It's wonderful to talk to you. Congratulations on your new book. You're in D.C. You're here in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., where I am. You're, in fact, in the same building because you've come to promote your book. Is that the truth? Is that the main reason you're here?
That is the truth. Yeah. I mean, of course, I used to live in D.C., so it's great to be back and see some old friends. But yeah, mostly I am ferociously promoting my book. Look here, promotion. The Logic of Life. Buy the book. You see, I'm promoting. I'm doing so yeah. I'm doing a tour of the U.S. I live in London these days, so to promote a U.S. book, it involves a lot of red-eye flights and a lot of hard work. But I love it really.
So the new book is The Logic of Life, The Rational Economics of an Irrational World, and you're Tim Harford. Tell folks a little bit about yourself, Sam.
Sure. Well, I used to work for the World Bank when I lived in D.C., but these days I'm a full-time writer. I'm on the editorial board of the Financial Times in London. I think I'm right in saying I'm the only economist in the world to run a problem page called Dear Economist, where I tell people whether they should dump their boyfriends or recompose their online dating ads or get a Brazilian wax, strictly using economic theory. And
you always get excellent results.
No one has ever written to say that what I advised them to do didn't work. So that's fun, and I think that's the only measure of success, right? I wrote a book called The Undercover Economist, which came out a couple of years ago. So I now write a column inspired by that book for the FT and Slate. Yes, this is a long bio. Sorry, no, talking about myself. Anyway, now I have this new book, The Logic of Life, and it was published last week.
Yeah, well, Tim, I just finished it this afternoon. And it's a phenomenally fun to read, incredibly informative book. There's actually a lot of things in here that I hadn't encountered. So there's this fits in a genre of pop economics books. But the thing that I think is special about The Logic of Life is that it doesn't just cover the same set of sort of economic puzzles that other books go over, like, why does popcorn cost so much at the movies or that kind of thing. You actually delve into a lot of, brand new economics research to illustrate the thesis of the book, which is that people are rational and respond to incentives.
Yeah, this is something that some economists almost all economists believe this is true, or roughly true, when you're buying a cup of coffee, or when you're going to the movies, or you're buying a new car, something like that. That people, broadly speaking, are rational. Otherwise, the whole edifice of economics doesn't work. There's also a minority of economists. Most notably Gary Becker from Chicago, who's a Nobel laureate, who would also go so far as to say, fine, well, but we can also apply that thinking to committing a crime. You weigh costs and benefits up, you think about the future consequences when you think you're committing a crime. Or when you're thinking, maybe I'll take up smoking. It'll be risky, but it'll look cool, and everyone says it's fun. I weigh up the costs and benefits. Or when you're deciding who to get married, when to get married, whether to get divorced. So this is sort of the applying rational choice, applying the economic view of behaviour way outside the usual commercial sphere. But there's a tension here, and I think this is what has excited me about The Logic of Life. When I met Becker in Chicago, I'm a big fan of his. I think he's a very compelling figure. We had lunch. I interviewed him for the Financial Times. There's a famous story about Becker that he told in his Nobel lecture in the early 1990s, how he came up with a theory of rational crime, which was he was running late to examine a student for a doctoral dissertation. This is back, I think, in the 60s. He realized the only way he was going to get there on time was to park illegally. And he very quickly thought to himself, how many traffic wardens do I see? What is the likelihood that I would get a ticket? How much would the ticket cost? And what is it worth to me not to be late? And he thought about it and he said, it's worth committing this parking offence. He then went into the PhD Viva and immediately started grilling the student about the theory of rational crime he'd just invented. Incidentally,
that doesn't seem quite fair.
Yeah, it's not very fair. But instantly, the student passed, and Becker didn't get a ticket. So there's a happy ending all round. And so I met Gary Becker, who's very, very gracious. He's a tall man now in his mid-70s, wispy hair. He's a grandfather. I went to his house and. He introduced me to his wife, we talked a little, and then he said, well, look, I'll drive you to the restaurant that I have in mind for our lunch and our interview. Drove me to the restaurant, pulled up in a parking space that said 30 minutes only. I'm thinking, we've planned 2 hours for lunch. And he just said, well, I don't think they checked that carefully. I still don't know whether he was playing to the camera, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I said, well, was that a rational crime? He said, yes, it was. Straight away. I can't do the Brooklyn accent that he has. So there's your Gary Becker, but here's the tension, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Then that's lots of fun, but he's 75. He is an economics professor. He is the quintessential. He's the Mr. Spock. He is Mr. Rationality. So fine, he is rational when he considers committing a parking offence. The question we really need to ask is. You've got a young man, he's 15 years old, he's got a knife, he's got a gun, he's taking drugs, he's desperate. Does he weigh up the costs and benefits? And that is the challenge to the rational view of the world. And that's what I think we quickly come up against in the logic of life, because what's new in economics is we now have much more evidence, much more data. We don't have to either believe Becker or not believe him. We can see the extent to which this hypothesis is true.
Yeah, and so I actually think, Tim, that your book is, as the viewers will have guessed from the way you just set that up, you're a very vivid narrator and a talented storyteller. So the book is just a blast to read. But really, you're mounting a very powerful vindication of the fundamental assumption of most of economics. The whole thing adds up to a big argument that shows all the data that's there to support the sort of Becker-style rational choice hypotheses. But before we dig deeper into how you made those cases in the book, let me run our listeners or viewers through the book chapter by chapter,
sure,
so that they get a more of a sort of a synoptic view of it. So you start off introducing the idea of this sort of economic way of thinking, that people rationally respond to incentives and what you do and don't mean by that. Yes. You move on to a discussion of rationality in gambling. So you go back to tell the story of the advent of game theory, how that was a theory of poker. You actually then illustrate it with stories from Las Vegas and competitive poker with Chris Jesus Ferguson. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of, the whole thing is spliced through with lots of different strands of of stories from recent economics, so it's hard to get the entire gist of it. But the story, you go through the history of game theory up through rational addiction and nuclear deterrence. And trust me, people, this all fits together in the argument of the book. You go into a chapter about called Is Divorce Underrated? That's about the market forces underlying marriage. A great discussion of the mating marketplace and the way...
The economics of speed dating, right?
The economics of speed dating, yeah. And quite a sort of interesting discussion of the sort of bargaining effects that asymmetries in the supply of men and women has. I found that really fascinating. Chapter 4 is Why Your Boss is Overpaid. You explore a couple theories about why life inside the firm seems irrational. In the Neighborhood is a discussion of this sort of economics of what would you say it is? Economics of cities and geography, why people choose to live where they live.
Your local neighborhood, what are the forces acting on it? What makes it a safe place or a dangerous place? What makes it an exciting place to live? And I look at deprived neighbourhoods. I look at racial segregation and a very interesting question, which is if you live in a bad neighbourhood, is that it? Is your neighbourhood your destiny, or can you transcend it? So that's what that chapter's about. There's a lot of
let's get back to
a lot of
question.
Washington in that as well.
Yeah, I especially enjoyed the Washington. You mentioned when you first moved here and got your job at the World Bank, the person in the World Bank office who was helping new employees figure out where to live would draw a line down 16th Street and tell you live anywhere on the west of this line.
Which 15 years ago might have been good advice. It was actually only it was closer to 5 years ago. I think she was maybe a bit behind the times. But
I live at 3rd Street now, Tim. So
you're a pioneer.
Yeah, that's right. Let's really quickly move on through the other chapters and then speak in earnest. 6 is the dangers of rational racism, in which you explore the statistical discrimination, or what you call rational racism. And that there's a powerful argument you put forth in favor of policies like affirmative action. I want to get back to that. Chapter 7.
I know you want to get through it quickly, but
no problem.
The phrase rational racism is so incendiary, and of course I use it in the book. Let me just be quite clear. What I'm talking about is there are certain types of racial discrimination that are immediately damaging to the racist. Yeah, hooray, thank you. And there are certain types of racism that are not. They can actually be profitable for the person who is being a racist, the person who's racially discriminating against. So when I say rational racism, I don't mean well-founded, just, noble, laudable. I mean profitable, in the same way that crime can be profitable. So that let's be clear about that.
Yeah, of course. And then the last 3 chapters, The World is Spiky, where you've stolen a title from Richard Florida. I think he has the same chapter heading in his forthcoming book.
He does. Although I do, to be fair, I do admit to stealing it. It's in the footnotes. Maybe I should have put it in the text that I stole the title. It's just such a beautiful title. In fact, I think actually your blog referred me to that article, "The World is Spiky," he wrote in Atlantic, which is a great piece.
I'll take responsibility for turning you on to something. And The World is Spiky is about what? The benefits of density and agglomeration?
Yeah, and why we live in cities, and why there's a case for encouraging us to live in cities even more.
Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I feel like I lost you there for a second.
Sure.
And it also explains, I think, why my people back home in Iowa are heavily subsidized.
Yeah, well, that takes us actually towards chapter 8, which is about the logic of politics, and why certain people are very successful at winning subsidies and certain people are not very successful at winning subsidies. And then more broadly, what does it take to overturn a political system, and what is there a logic behind when you see revolutions? You can see we're nearly at the end of the book here, but you can see how the book sort of broadens out from quite small decisions to the big picture.
And then you end with a million years of logic, in which you survey the entire broad sweep of history.
I'm just kind of having fun with that one. I mean, I thought if we're going to take the big picture, let's just go back a million years. I briefly played with the idea of having an epilogue that tried to apply economic logic to space exploration and the infinity of space, and then of course I realised that was completely ridiculous, and probably going back in time a million years was probably enough.
Well, a lot of people will find the argument that you mount there equally ridiculous, even though I'm already persuaded of it. You talk about Michael Kramer's work on the importance of population growth to economic growth, that the rate of technological innovation is a function of the size of the population. And so you mentioned the old Ted Baxter joke from Mary Tyler Moore, the idea that he says, I'm going to have 6 children and maybe one of them will solve the population problem.
Yeah, and it's a great joke, but Michael Kramer in his paper picks up this joke and sort of says, well, actually, maybe it's not that funny. Maybe having 6 children so one of them can solve the population problem is the right way to go.
Yeah, so and a lot of people I think would find that pretty counterintuitive. I think there might be something to be said about that in terms of global warming as well. So maybe we'll talk about that as well, like whether we should whether we have a race between technological progress that would fix the problem or technological progress leading to our ultimate demise. I think it sort of ties into that logic. Sure. But let's go back to the beginning and talk a little bit about your case for the idea that everybody actually is rational, that people really do act rationally, respond to incentives. Now, that idea has come under attack by a lot of behavioral economists, which is a group of economists and psychologists who, have shown in laboratory settings that the classical rationality assumptions don't always hold true.
Yeah.
And you say, yeah, that's fine, but there's sort of limitations to what you can sort of milk out of that as a conclusion. And you give the example of, what's his name, List?
Tell us. I mean, there's a puzzle here because the behavioral economists, these are very smart guys. Got a lot of respect for them, doing very clever work, and they are very, very good at putting people in laboratories and getting them to do odd things that either explicitly violate the traditional axioms of rationality, which, by the way, in the book I have a more pragmatic definition of rationality than the strict sort of mathematical ones that economists would adopt, but leaving that to one side, they're very good at doing this, often in the lab, sometimes in the field. But my question to the behavioral economist is, how does that square with, I think, a lot of persuasive evidence that people are very good at responding to incentives. And one of the things that I thought was a great contribution to the debate was another Chicago economics professor, John List, who specializes in taking these classic laboratory results and trying to replicate them in the field. And so one of my favorite examples was there's a classic result that if you hire somebody to do a job and then you pay them above the odds a surprising amount of money for the job, then they are grateful and irrationally, since they don't have to, so this doesn't fit into the classic norms of economics, irrationally they work hard because they just feel grateful to you. And there's this gift exchange idea, which it doesn't fit easily inside classical economic thought. I mean, it has a good pedigree. It's proposed by George Akerlof, who's another Nobel laureate. It's a very respectable idea, and the lab work seemed to suggest that, yes, this was one of the things that's going on. So John List said, okay, fine, that's great. Why don't I actually hire some people to do a real job? Why don't I actually pay them more money? Because the lab work was so abstract. No one was actually ever doing any work. They were just ticking boxes saying, well, I would do this or I would do that. Those boxes had some financial consequences, but it's just not the same as actually working. The List went out and he hired people to input data into a library database. He hired people to go door to door soliciting for charity, and he did a randomized controlled trial, which is a method that I'm a big fan of and push a lot in the book. He divided these people up into people who got the advertised wage. They were hired through a temping agency, and then people who just before they went out were told, good news, you thought you were going to get $10 an hour, actually you're going to get $15 an hour. Thanks very much for all your hard work, and off you go. And he found that just as in the laboratory, people did work hard. He also found that this effect lasted 90 minutes. For the data entry people, for the charity doorsteps, it lasted until lunch. So, which is way longer than you would actually put them in the laboratory for. So, yeah, this effect exists, but the question is, how important is it in reality? And I think that explains some of the tension that we see between the behavioral economics work. This is very important work, very good work, and what we see in the patterns of everyday life, which is again and again rationality.
Yeah, I think that actually raises an interesting question, Tim, that I've thought a lot about. I mean, sometimes because I'm a very sort of markety and I have a sort of rational choice approach to a lot of questions, people will accuse me of being spreading a kind of propaganda. There's a kind of neoclassical sort of Chicago school view of the world in which people are these rational calculators. And the funny thing is, I specifically don't actually believe that. I think that people are incredibly bounded in their rational capacities. They're incredibly limited in their abilities to process information. I've been more influenced by Hayek, who talks about rationality as something that's very contextually embedded, that people kind of learn how to think in the environment that they have to grapple with. And so if you think of rationality as being sort of ecologically adaptive rather than just this computer that you carry around in your head that's invariant over all contexts, then you won't be surprised to find rationality, sort of the classical normative assumptions about rationality failing in a laboratory environment, which is exactly the environment that people don't actually act in. But you would be surprised to find people behaving irrationally or counterproductively in the kind of context that's their bread and butter, that they spend all their time in. And you do a wonderful job of showing, bringing to bear evidence that shows that that's true.
I mean, let's be fair to the behavioural economists. That certainly we make mistakes outside the lab, but I argue that I'm not arguing we're 100% Mr. Spock, but on the Homer Simpson to Mr. Spock spectrum, I think we're a lot closer to Mr. Spock than most people give us credit for, and a lot of that is because, as you say, we're on familiar ground. We're in our jobs. We're shopping in familiar shops. We're hanging out with familiar people. We're making trade-offs about all kinds of decisions. Our diet and our are we going to run across the road before the lights turn green? And, all these decisions we make. These are in a familiar context. One of the first examples in the book, I talk about prostitutes in Mexico who are taking serious health risks by not using condoms in exchange for extra money, and I show that they seem to be very, very calculating about this. They seem to really have pinned down the risks very precisely. There's a flip side to that story, which is the clients are being idiots. I mean, there's no defense for what the clients are doing. This doesn't make any sense. But they're willing to pay more and take bigger risks. I'm sure the sex is more fun. But they're not reacting sensibly to the risks they face. But then why should they? Because this is a very unfamiliar decision for them. The prostitutes are experts and the clients are novices.
Exactly.
So I think that's important to bear in mind.
One of the things that I really liked about the section about the prostitutes in Mexico, especially, and this is one of the things that I actually cherish about the allegedly reductive rationality postulate, is that it requires that you take people's choices seriously. It requires that you respect people's agency, and that your first assumption, even if it looks like people might be acting self-destructively, your first assumption is that their behavior makes sense given the constraints that they face. And I think that just having that attitude causes us to extend a certain kind of dignity and respect to people rather than thinking that they're just objects being pushed around by forces. And this is especially the case in cases like prostitution or in any kind of trade that is kind of taboo, where lots of people would be like, nobody would decide to be a prostitute. Nobody would decide to, there's a whole list of jobs where people automatically assume that people are being coerced or aren't choosing rationally simply because of the fact that they're engaged in something that is taboo or low status. But so I think
at the same time, something that I emphasize in the book, I have rather vague libertarian tendencies relative to my fellow Europeans, but I'm not an out-and-out libertarian.
Sure.
The assumption and the evidence that people do have agency, that their decisions deserve respect, pushes you more towards a libertarian viewpoint. At the same time, you also start to think seriously about, Number one, these people have a very limited set of choices, and is there any way we can give them better choices? Is there any way that we can improve their situation? You immediately start thinking about that. And you also start thinking about the social consequences of individually rational decisions, which is not a new idea. We've known that for a while, but that comes out again and again and again. People doing the best for themselves, being smart, looking out for themselves, and then the social consequences of that sometimes being very harmful. So I think there's a balanced view on that in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And but I think you're exactly right, that once you start seeing that people in bad situations are often doing the best they can and acting rationally within a really bounded set of options, then you start thinking, how do we make their options better rather than how do we stop them from doing this?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And I think that's just a much more, it lead to a more likely solution to the problem than just sort of condemning people for being engaged in the activity in the first place. Related to your idea of the way individually rational choices sort of scale up to negative consequences, I wanted to talk a little bit about mating markets, but also one thing that I just wanted to observe about your book is that it actually, running through it, this is actually one of the most insightful books that I've read about race and poverty in the United States in recent times, which is, it's not what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting to actually, because I've been working on papers on a paper on economic inequality, and I wasn't expecting to find a great deal of insight about the economic inequalities that come out of racial inequality. But there's a lot of examples that you give that help illuminate that problem, and it runs from the mating market for African Americans in the inner city, which has certain properties that we'll talk about, the nature of statistical discrimination that you discuss in your chapter about that, about how it can make sense to act white in the way that Roland Fryer talks about. So I'd like to come back around to that, because I think one of the unintended side effects of the book for me was a great deal of illumination about one of our thorniest social problems, which is sort of
it strikes me, Will, that as you're saying, it's very kind of you to say this. Thank you. As you're saying this, the more thoughtful viewers will be thinking, how on earth does a white middle class Englishman write one of the most insightful? One of the most insightful books about race in America. If it is, then that's because it speaks to the method of the book. The method of the book is, I want to go out and find the researchers who are doing the most interesting, innovative, creative work in whatever field that I'm studying in that particular chapter. There are economists such as Roland Fryer, Glenn Lowry, Sendhil Mullainathan, Kerwin Coker Charles, who are doing really, I think, profound, important, provocative work on race. There are many other economists doing profound, important, provocative work on other subjects. So if the book says anything interesting, it's because their research is fascinating.
Yeah, well, it was a combination of introducing me to research that I hadn't known about before, and then pulling stuff that I did know about before together in a way that I found quite illuminating. But before we get more into that, maybe we can talk about something that seems slightly more frivolous on the surface, is the nature of mating markets.
Tell us a little bit about whether you view this as frivolous or not. I think depends on whether you're a man or a woman. Because one of the main messages from the book is that in most metropolitan areas, not just in the States but across the world, women of dating age outnumber men. So they're in excess supply. This puts them in a very weak bargaining position. This is why they have to work so hard. This is why most wives are smarter than their husbands, because they have to be, because it's such a competitive market. This is why so many women study for degrees much more than men. It's an extremely reassuring read if you are male and live in DC like you do, Will. It's an extremely unnerving read for the other half of the population.
Yeah, Yeah, the example that you give, the little thought experiment to prime your intuition is the marriage supermarket, and you ask us to imagine, what was it? There's 100 men and 100 women, and all you have to do is match up with a member of the opposite sex and walk it to the checkout counter, and they'll give you $100, and the $100 represents the manifold benefits of marriage, which aren't just financial, but it's just a way of looking at the...
many people want to get married, and this is a representation of that. People would also like to have $100.
But then you point out that... Yes. But then you point out that if there's only one less woman than man, then, just in the stylized way of thinking, this creates a huge bargaining problem for all the women. Can you explain the logic of that?
So this is a very stylized example, but actually I think it's one of the only stylized examples in the book, but it just seemed important in this case. So
it's very helpful. It helped me.
Thank you. It was in this particular case when all you care about is you just need to pair up with someone of the opposite sex, and then you get the prize, which is $100. The one woman, you then have 99 pairs and one woman who doesn't have a man to pair with because one of the men is missing. He's gay, he's in the countryside, he's in prison, whatever.
He's an economist.
He's an economist, as I say. For whatever reason, he's not suitable. And in this situation, that one woman is able to offer a better deal to any of the 99 guys, and she's capable of basically affecting the bargaining power in all of these relationships simultaneously. And in that very extreme example, basically just the one missing man throws the market totally in favour of the men. Clearly, things aren't that extreme. We don't actually negotiate over who's going to do the dishes and how many candlelit dinners per week. We don't actually do that, but we do see the effects of an imbalanced marriage market in some important real world examples.
Yeah, so in parity, where the idea is if they get the $100 at the checkout, they're just going to divide it 50-50. But when there's fewer women than men, the woman who is left out would rather have something rather than nothing, so she's willing to tell a man, say, well, I'll take 40 instead of 50, and then some other woman who would then be left out has said, well, I'll take 30, and then you get to the point where all the women have to offer like just a penny just so that they can go with someone.
Absolutely.
And of course that's not the way it is, but I found that a powerful way of priming my intuitions to tackle the problem that you end up talking about the asymmetries in the sort of inner city black populations where there's a large percentage of marriageable aged black males in prison. Because of the drug war largely, but
incredibly serious situation. I was shocked when I read this research, which is still preliminary research from Ming Luo and from Kofi Charles in Chicago, who has written a lot of very interesting papers on various aspects of race in America, and they point out that there are several American states where 10, 20, even in one state, I think New Mexico, is something like 30% of young black men are in prison. 30%. It's incredible.
That's a travesty.
Now, given that situation, then that very abstract example we discussed about this cute little marriage supermarket, suddenly it's not cute at all, because then you think about the young black women and the situation they're in. There are just not enough young men to go around. Now, of course, so one solution to that is interracial marriage, which I have absolutely no objection to. It just doesn't happen. It's still extremely rare for whatever reason. So given that, you have a situation where these young women know it's difficult for them to get married because there aren't enough men to go around, and even if they did get married, they might have to marry on rather unfair terms. They wouldn't necessarily expect their husband to be faithful. It's very important to point out that this is something that's usually, I think, from the right, decried as being sort of disgraceful black culture and it's a cultural thing. And what the book shows is there's nothing to do with the culture. There's no comment on the culture at all. It's a comment on the economic incentives. And in states where not many young black men are in prison because the war on drugs just didn't take off there. The situation is completely different. People behave in a very different way. And interestingly, we talked earlier about respecting people's agency and seeing how people behave in difficult situations. What you find is the young women in that situation, they find that the marriage market lets them down. They stay in school longer, do evening classes, they work harder, they're more likely to have a job. So they immediately they realise they're in a tough situation, and they work very hard to get out of it.
That's one of the things I found really illuminating, Tim, because I was aware of the very large inequality in college enrollment and college completion, or even high school completion, between black men and black women. But I hadn't ever encountered the idea that the larger percentage of black women going to college is partly a function that they need to set themselves apart. They need to look more attractive so that they can find one of the very scarce mates.
Well, partly that, and partly also if they feel that they can't rely on the marriage market, well, they have to take care of themselves. And if they have to take care of themselves, then that again is a strong incentive to go to college.
I found that really fascinating. Let's talk a little bit more about marriage generally. So, like, another aspect of sort of the breakdown of traditional marriages, and this, by the way, is what we're discussing on Cato Unbound this month as well.
An excellent discussion. Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers, whose work I cite quite extensively in the book, written a great essay there. So go to Cato Unbound and check it out. Absolutely.
So why don't you explain a little bit, Tim, about how it is that that sort of economic forces have changed the nature of marriage, the way the division of labor has played in sort of pulling apart the sort of the traditional gender breakdown in marriages.
So what we had in the 50s was a situation where quite a lot of what was going on in a marriage was an economic decision. Of course, people got together, they loved each other, and they had loving marriages, and all the romance was a big part of it. But also, it was an economic imperative. People were too poor to enjoy a good life in the 50s by themselves. There's so much more you could achieve, especially if you wanted to raise a family, if two of you were working together. Traditional boring economies of scale, like you can afford a better house together. You're sharing a bed; you need to afford one bed. Mm-hmm. This is really this is the Mr. Spock part of the economics. So the first question then is, well, given that you are working together to raise a family, to put a roof over your heads, what is the efficient way to divide the labour? And we go right back to Adam Smith's pin factory, and we know that actually specialisation works very well. So it's probably a good idea if at least one person specialises in earning a lot of money, and then we see what the other person does. There are all kinds of homemaking activities that the other partner could do. So you have that situation. Then you also have another traditional economic principle of comparative advantage, and that says, well, whoever is relatively best at one of these tasks should do it. What we found is men historically have been the ones who go out to work. The great insight of comparative advantage is that doesn't tell you anything about whether men are actually more capable about going out to work. What it does tell you is that men are extremely poor parents of young children.
So they're even worse at raising children than they are at making widgets.
Well, we have every reason, I think, now to believe that women are superior at almost everything to men in the modern world, which doesn't require much physical effort. But anyway, for whatever reason, genetics, socialization, discrimination, we don't need to know the reason. There's a strong push for specialization, and given that you're going to specialize, the specialisation is usually in favour of the woman stays at home and the man goes out to work. That's the 50s, okay, and we recognise this model in the 50s. Something then changes in the 60s, and it's a combination of the changing workforce, the kinds of jobs people are doing are decreasingly manual and increasingly intellectual jobs. Women can do them just as well. plus the pill. Women now have control over their fertility. They can get married, or they can have a sexual relationship outside marriage without much risk of having children. So they can control the timing of their pregnancy much more. Well, that change. This is a big change. And it's not just about college parties suddenly becoming more fun. This is a change that says you can control your fertility. That means you can study to be a doctor, you can study to be a lawyer, you can study to be a dentist. And when you look at the statistics, the way that women suddenly flooded the advanced graduate schools, the professions that took a long, long time to study for, when the pill became available to unmarried women, it's amazing how quickly and how profoundly that shift happened. At the same time, we all were growing richer. So by the time you reach the 70s, there's really far less supposition that men are any particular use as breadwinners. Also, we're richer, so there's no reason why the man and the woman couldn't both go out to work. You have control over your fertility. A woman can build a career throughout her 20s and early 30s before she decides to have children. Plenty of time to establish a career. So the whole traditional unit breaks down. You just don't have to be married anymore, unless you want to be. What we discovered in the 1970s is a lot of people didn't want to be. And one of the astonishing things you discover in the book, and this is from Stevenson and Wolfer's work, is that as divorce got easier, all kinds of bad things happened. People wouldn't support each other through college anymore. People delayed having children purely because they were insecure in their marriage. But lots of good things happened as well. Domestic violence was down. Female suicide was down. Husbands murdering their wives, that was down.
It was incredible. Women could finally... they could credibly threaten that they were going to exit, then men had to treat them better.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, of course, just the coda to the story, I think we haven't really appreciated this, but divorce rates have been falling for about 20 years. And that's the final sort of playing out of this, which is, okay, we had to get rid of all the marriages that people didn't want. Now what happens, rather than getting married early and then getting divorced, is people just don't get married at all until much later. They take much more care over their marriage. So we have less marriage rather than just as much marriage and more divorce. So that's sort of still been playing out over the decades. That was really interesting to explore.
Yeah, one of the very illuminating things to me about thinking about the economic forces that are sort of come to bear on marriage and family is that the sort of huge cascade of divorces through the 70s and the peak to the very early 80s was the way to understand that isn't any kind of breakdown in people's sense of the value of family. It has to do with the sort of lag of cultural norms, the sort of mismatch of a cultural norm with the economic incentives in place. So people had gotten married on the expectation of a division of labor marriage, but that world had disappeared. And so, the division and the traditional division of labor marriage includes within it certain kinds of like sexist assumptions about what men and women's roles are, and I think that still remains sticky, and we're still seeing turbulence because of the lag of these sexist cultural expectations. But we have this sort of period where you just hit this tumult that because of just the complete mismatch of what women want and what's available to them and what their incentives are with the nature of the marriages that they've got matched up in. And so those relationships fall apart, and then people search for partners who are sort of optimal given the new set of incentives. And that's why we see marriages starting later. Why I'm a perfectly typical person, a 35-year-old single person who lives, single, a 35-year-old who
keep telling yourself that, you're normal, don't worry. We all believe
I'm completely normal. But I feel like I completely exemplify this kind of trend where I've lived with a number of different girlfriends, and just the idea of just getting married always struck me as just kind of weird and rash. And the after college, when I moved in with my then girlfriend just after college, my family didn't like it very much, and they're fairly conservative. But I think everybody recognized that it just didn't make sense. It wasn't any kind of economic necessity.
I have a slightly different experience, and maybe that shows there's the cultural difference. Where I had a serious girlfriend while I was at college, and we were briefly engaged, and My father didn't like that at all. He'd much rather that we were just boyfriend and girlfriend. He felt that it was far too early to get married. Well, he didn't get married in the end, so I think he was probably right. But that was interesting, this idea that, you have this relationship with someone, your parents are just trying to persuade you that could you please wait another 10 years before you get married. I think that's a sign of the times.
Yeah, and what Stevenson and Wolfer said, the new marriage is what they call hedonic marriage, is that the partners are what they call consumption partners, that we're not a joint economic unit for production because we can each produce independently. There's still economies of scale, and you still can benefit from sharing household public goods and so forth. But mainly what you're there for is to consume together. And that's why it's
enjoy
important.
Yourselves and have fun.
To enjoy yourselves and have fun, and that's why it's important to find somebody whose tastes really match yours, because, what's the point of having somebody to always go to movies with if you like different kinds of movies?
You can see this book just writes itself, because you take fantastic research from people like Wolfers and Stevenson, and then you just take out all the terrible jargon like hedonic marriages and consumption partnerships, and you just get rid of all that and just translate it into English, and you have the most fantastic insights that these economists are producing. I mean, Justin and Betsy are, very, very exciting creative economists, but there are so many of them now. There are so many really, really good researchers in the field. It's really exciting. This is the great contribution of free economics was to reveal that it was possible there was at least one economist in the world who was a really exciting guy doing really exciting things. And once Steve Dubner and Steve Levitt had kicked down that particular door, suddenly everyone sort of thought, hey, if there's one, there might be more than one. Well, I reckon, I've got about 100. I'm sure there are many more. There are lots and lots of very interesting researchers out there now.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about a couple more of them. Let's skip ahead to your chapter on the dangers of rational racism, which is another one that I found incredibly illuminating. You talk about maybe you can tell us about the experiment with the greens and the purples, and tell us how that illuminates sort of structural inequality.
This was so striking, and this is a teaching game. It wasn't even designed to produce a powerful research result, but I think what happened was very illuminating. This was research carried out by Roland Fryer of Harvard, who's now a young man with a very big reputation, Jacob Goury, and I forget the third researcher, so apologies to him or her. And what they did was they just got students plugged in, sitting in front of computers and interacting with each other anonymously via the computers. And the basic game was some of these students were playing the role of employers and some were playing the role of employees. Really abstract. The employees had to decide whether to get an education or not. At the end of this game, everyone is going to be paid a certain amount of money depending on how well they played, what decisions they made. So an education is expensive, so you're going to get less money at the end of the game if you choose to get an education. So you just click yes or no. Then there's a random element. These are the dice are thrown. And workers who've got an education are more likely to pass this, and again, it's all abstract, to pass a test. But they're not guaranteed to pass the test, and workers who don't get an education can also pass the test. So there's a mixture of luck and your educational investment. So there's a setup. And then you've got employers. They just have two pieces of information. What the test result was, which gives you a hint about whether the worker is educated or not. And they're also told whether the worker is green or purple. Because totally arbitrarily, the workers were separated into the green camp and the purple camp. That's all the employers saw. And the employer's aim, the employer gets paid if they successfully hire a worker with education. So really what they should be looking at is the test result. That's the only bit of information they have. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It just so happened that the early rounds, the green workers, I think it was the green workers, happened to pull ahead. They were quite lucky with the cost that they faced of getting education, which was random. They were quite likely to choose an education because it turned out to be cheap for them. The employers initially would just employ based on the test score. But after a couple of rounds, people were being given feedback. The employers would then see, hang on a moment, the green workers keep turning out to be educated, and the purple workers keep not being educated. So then the employers start fixating on the colour just as much as on the test score. In fact, they start fixating on the colour more than the test score. At the same time, the green workers are thinking to themselves, well, this is great, we get education, we get picked every time, this is fantastic. The purple workers are saying to themselves, it doesn't matter if we get an education because we don't get picked. And so the purple workers gave up. They stopped getting education. The more this happened, the more the workers were the employers were absolutely rational to only hire green workers. So you have this.
It became just a self-reinforcing feedback.
Self-reinforcing, totally arbitrary. There's no way someone has a visceral dislike of clicking a button to employ a purple worker. You know, there's no history of slavery. There's no background to this. It's purely arbitrary. And yet people were able to use the colour as a marker, and they started interpreting from the statistics. Initially over-interpreting, but then the over-interpretation reinforced itself. And when the classroom experiment finished, the kids were furious. They were furious. The purple workers were saying, you wouldn't hire me. We didn't invest in education because you wouldn't hire us. And the employers were going, well, we wouldn't hire you because you didn't invest in education. It's this chicken and egg situation. So there's an interesting bit of background. It's just a lab experiment. It's just abstract. I'm cautioned about those. Add to that an amazing piece of work that got quite a lot of press by Marion Bertrand and Sendel Mulanathan. These guys thought to themselves, I wonder if affirmative action policies that most corporations have adopted, I wonder if they actually mean anything. What we're going to do is we're going to create 5,000 resumes. They're based on resumes we've downloaded off the web, but we changed the names, we anonymised them a bit, we changed the colleges, we changed the phone numbers. We've got 5,000 realistic-looking resumes. Some are good, some are mediocre. And then just before we mail them out, we get a computer to assign either a very distinctively black name, like Tyrone or Latonia, or a very distinctively white name, like Brendan or Alison. And these, the question is, who says this is a black name or a white name? Well, they actually went out...
Or William Wilkinson or Timothy Harford.
Yeah, it seems like a white name, doesn't it? But they surveyed people. I mean, there are some names. Trying to
seem ambiguous. Yeah,
that are ambiguous. There are some names that actually are. Maurice is one. Maurice is actually a very, very common black name, but is not perceived as being a black name. So they went for the ones that were perceived as being black names. Anyway, so here's what won't surprise anybody. Well, except maybe a few personnel departments who were on their high horses. The CVs with distinctively black names got far lower callback rates than the CVs with distinctively white names. That's very upsetting, disturbing. And
that was the only difference. The only difference was just the name.
Because it was random. You had 5,000 CVs, and you were tossing a coin whether it was a black name or a white name, black name or a white name. So you're really quite sure that this is a real effect. It's like a random trial that you would use to evaluate a new medicine. So that's disturbing. These sorts of trials have been going on for decades, but this was recent and very big by the usual standards. But here's something else they found. And then you think back to Roland Fryer's classroom experiment. They found that it didn't matter whether the apparently black resumes had excellent qualifications or mediocre qualifications. It didn't make any difference to the callback rate. It wasn't relevant. It should have been relevant, but it didn't seem to be relevant. For the apparently white resumes, the employers discriminated in the positive sense of the word. They discriminated between good and bad CVs. They read the CVs, they thought about the CVs, and they invited people whose resumes appeared to indicate they were well qualified. So put those two things together, and then you think, again, respecting people's agency, as you were saying, thinking about how people respond. If you are young and you're smart and you're African American and you are deciding, do I want to go through all the hassle of studying? Do I want to go to college? Do I want to get qualifications? and then you're aware that there is this systematic bias, that your qualifications are not going to be taken seriously, what's your response? Don't bother. And that is self-fulfilling. That's profoundly pernicious, and I don't think it's impossible to get out of, but it's very hard.
Yeah. So what do you? I mean, it's so vexing how to get out of one of those sort of self-reinforcing feedback loops that it's very, very difficult to, like, you advise. You're in favor of affirmative action programs, just in virtue, and I think that's the best argument for affirmative action programs, even if there's because sometimes people worry about the stigma that's involved in having you just filled a quota. You didn't really deserve this job, but that's not looking at it from the right perspective. The right perspective is looking at it from the perspective of a black student who's trying to figure out whether to make the marginal investment in their education, and whether or not there's actually going to be a position available to them that would reward them for their efforts. And so I think that is probably the best argument for just having positions, in some sense, set aside for minorities to create an incentive to basically credibly commit to the idea that there will be positions available to you if you invest in getting an education.
I mean, it's clearly a very fraught and complex policy decision, but I think that has to be a guiding principle to think about it. So much affirmative action has been either about hitting quotas and making things seem okay, or about righting wrongs. And I understand that. But if you have a situation where, as it seems we have, the cards are stacked in such a way as to discourage young black kids from getting an education, the wrong kind of affirmative action policy could make it even worse. So if you just say, it doesn't matter whether you study, if the current situation is it doesn't matter whether you study, you won't get the job anyway, and the new situation is it doesn't matter whether you study, you will get the job, well, that's not really solved the problem. But if the affirmative action program can be calibrated such that you've said, look, well, you have a chance now, but you're going to have to study. But if you study, we'll take you seriously. I think that's tremendously difficult. I wouldn't go so far as just to say, we need affirmative action, it's obviously the right thing to do. I wouldn't say that, but I think it's worth considering. And you need to consider it, as we've been saying, from the point of view of what it does to people's incentives, what it does to their agency, what choices it helps them to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, like I said, I'm not sure, like, all things considered, I still think that perhaps the affirmative action can be counterproductive, but that is far and away, I think, the most powerful argument in favor of it. We're running short on time, Tim. We should, I guess, I'd love to talk more about the incentives involved in politics, and because if there's one thing that I'd like people to know about when they're thinking about politics is the logic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs that you explained so well. Do you want to say something about that for just 2 minutes?
Sure. I could reinforce it. I could hold the cover up again. The logic of life. It's in all good bookshops. That's a concentrated interest for you. The basic idea is, why do certain groups very, very successful at winning political pork, winning subsidies, sure, there are some causes that are very emotional and so on. There's all that going on, but there's also a pretty cast iron logic to a lot of it. If you imagine a bright, new, promising, innovative industry, a high-tech industry, biotechnology. These are, if you believe any of the arguments for protectionism, for government subsidy, for industrial policy, they've got to be about protecting young industries, helping them to coordinate, helping them to innovate. Those are the only credible arguments for government subsidy of industry. None of those guys get any subsidies. Who gets the subsidies? The steel industry, agribusiness, the car industry. So the question is why? Because there are no good economic arguments for why those guys should get the subsidy. And the answer is, well, there is no reason for the high-tech industry to lobby for subsidy. because it's a fast-growing industry, lots of new entrants, lots of competition. A government subsidy would simply attract in new competitors. So you have the subsidy, that's nice, but you have to divvy it up with more people, and they're all going to bring your margins down and compete for time for customers, compete for venture capitalist funding. It's really not clear you've gained anything. Certainly, if you apply the strict economic logic, you will gain nothing. In reality, it's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah.
But your reasons for lobbying are pretty weak. Now you think about a high entry barrier, capital intensive, stagnating or even shrinking industry, like the steel industry or the car industry. It's impossible. It's not impossible. It's very expensive to enter this industry. Or agribusiness. It's very hard to enter the agribusiness industry because you can't make more land. A little bit, but basically you can't really make more land, more arable land. So if these guys apply for a subsidy and they successfully get it, there are going to be no new competitors. No one's going to set up a new car company to pick up a subsidy. It's just too.
Right.
It's just not worth it unless the subsidy was Titanic.
Yeah.
And so these guys have a much stronger incentive. Now, I don't know whether that's the real reason that the car industry gets subsidised and protected and the steel industry gets protected, but I find it very interesting that the pattern of subsidy that we see matches so closely with the economic logic.
The logic fits the facts pretty well, I would say.
It seems that way, and as so often as we discover in the book.
Well, Tim, I think our time is up, but again, I wanted to reinforce that if you're looking for a really entertaining and readable introduction to a lot of the most interesting new work in economics, The Logic of Life is probably about the best that you're going to do. So congratulations on a wonderful book, and let's hope it flies off the shelves.
Thank you very much. Well, lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Tim. Take care.
Bye.